Captain Jake Morrison wiped grease from his hands and stared at the navigation console that had been giving him trouble for the past 3 days. The Lucky Strike was not the prettiest ship in the galaxy, but she got the job done most of the time. Today was not one of those times. The old cargo freighter drifted through space while Jake tried to figure out where exactly they were and how to get where they needed to go. The navigation system had decided to take a break right when they needed it most. Kate Sullivan, his chief engineer, crawled out from under the main console with her toolkit in one hand and a frustrated expression on her face. She had been working on the broken system since yesterday morning and was running out of patience with the stubborn machine. Carlos Hernandez sat in the pilot seat, tapping his fingers on the controls and humming an old song his grandmother used to sing. He was not worried about being lost in space because he had been in worse situations before. Amy Foster checked her weapon systems for the 10th time that hour, not because she expected trouble, but because checking weapons was what she did when she was nervous. Dr. Nathan Cross organized his medical supplies in the small sickbay, whistling softly to himself as he worked. The crew of the Lucky Strike had been together for 2 years now, and they had learned to trust each other even when everything seemed to be going wrong. Jake looked out the main viewing screen at the stars that all looked the same to him. Somewhere out there was their destination, a mining colony that needed the equipment they were carrying. The problem was that without navigation, they had no idea which direction to go. Kate stood up and brushed dust off her work clothes. She had been an engineer for 15 years and had worked on ships that were much better maintained than the Lucky Strike. This old freighter was held together by spare parts, determination, and what she liked to call creative problem-solving. The navigation computer was supposed to be a simple system, but nothing on this ship was ever simple. She had tried 3 different approaches to fix it, and none of them had worked the way they were supposed to work. Jake walked over to where Kate was standing and looked at the mess of wires and circuit boards she had spread across the floor. He did not understand how any of it worked, but he trusted Kate to figure it out eventually. That was the good thing about having a crew you could depend on. Everyone had their job and everyone was good at what they did. Carlos called out from the pilot seat that he was picking up some strange readings on the long-range sensors. The readings did not look like anything he had seen before, but then again the sensors on the Lucky Strike were almost as old as the navigation system. Amy moved to the weapons console and started running diagnostics on their defensive systems. They were not a military ship, but they carried enough firepower to discourage pirates and other troublemakers. Dr. Cross came out of the medical bay to see what was happening. He was curious about everything and always wanted to know what was going on around the ship. Jake studied the sensor readings that Carlos was showing him on the secondary screen. There were definitely other ships out there, but they were still too far away to identify. The ships seemed to be moving in a formation that suggested they were military vessels of some kind. Kate looked up from her work and suggested that maybe they should try to avoid whoever was out there until they got their navigation system working properly. Getting lost was bad enough without running into hostile aliens at the same time. Carlos agreed that avoiding contact would be smart, but he pointed out that their engines were not running at full power either. Kate had been working on so many different systems that some things were not connected the way they should be connected. The Lucky Strike was limping through space on backup power and spare parts. Amy reported that the unknown ships were definitely heading in their direction and were moving faster than the Lucky Strike could move in its current condition. Jake made the decision that they would try to make peaceful contact rather than run away. Running away never worked very well when your ship was barely holding together anyway. Kate went back to work on the navigation system, while Carlos tried to get more power from the engines. Amy prepared the communication systems to send out a peaceful greeting to whoever was approaching them. Dr. Cross went back to his medical bay to get ready for whatever might happen next. The sensors showed that there were at least 6 ships in the approaching formation, and they were much larger than the Lucky Strike. Jake hoped that whoever was flying those ships would be reasonable and not looking for a fight. The Lucky Strike was obviously not a threat to anyone in its current condition. Kate managed to get the navigation system partially working, just as the unknown ships came into visual range. What they saw on the main screen made everyone stop what they were doing and stare. The approaching vessels were unlike anything any of them had ever seen before. The ships were elegant and powerful looking, with smooth lines and a design that seemed almost artistic. They moved through space with perfect precision and coordination that suggested advanced technology and military training. Jake realized that they had wandered into someone else's territory without meaning to do so. Carlos whispered that those ships looked like they could destroy the Lucky Strike without even slowing down. Amy double-checked that their weapons were powered down, and their communication systems were broadcasting their peaceful intentions. Kate looked at her partially repaired navigation system and confirmed that they had indeed drifted far off course. Dr. Cross wondered what kind of aliens built ships that looked so different from human designs. The lead ship in the formation sent out a communication signal that the Lucky Strike's computer tried to translate. The message was short and direct, telling them to surrender immediately or face the consequences. Jake looked around at his crew and saw the same determination in their eyes that had gotten them through difficult situations before. He opened a communication channel and prepared to find out what kind of trouble they had stumbled into this time. Admiral Kethvar stood on the bridge of the Eternal Dominion and watched the strange vessel that his patrol ships had discovered drifting in forbidden space. The ship looked like someone had taken pieces from 10 different vessels and stuck them together without any plan or purpose. It was ugly and crude compared to the elegant warships of the Zephyrian Empire, yet something about it made him feel uneasy. Commander Zixtal approached with a data pad containing their initial scan results of the alien craft. The readings made no sense according to everything they knew about proper starship design and engineering principles. The vessel appeared to be held together by materials that should not work for space travel, powered by systems that violated basic physics, and operated by creatures that had no understanding of advanced technology. Jake Morrison tried to remain calm as the massive Zephyrian ship pulled the Lucky Strike into its docking bay, using a tractor beam that was more powerful than anything humans had ever built. His crew gathered on the bridge to watch through the viewing ports as they were drawn inside a space so huge it could have held 20 ships their size. The Zephyrian vessel was a marvel of engineering with smooth walls that seemed to glow with their own light and machinery that operated without any visible moving parts. Kate Sullivan stared at the alien technology with the fascination of an engineer who had spent her career making broken things work with whatever materials she could find. The Zephyrian systems looked perfect and clean and efficient in ways that human technology never managed to achieve. Carlos Hernandez whistled softly under his breath as he watched alien crew members moving around the docking bay with precise movements that reminded him of a carefully choreographed dance. Amy Foster kept her hand near her sidearm even though she knew it would be useless against enemies with technology this advanced. Dr. Nathan Cross pulled out his medical scanner and began taking readings of the environment around them, curious about what kind of atmosphere and gravity the aliens preferred. The Lucky Strike settled onto the deck of the docking bay with a series of mechanical groans and hisses that made Kate wince, because she knew exactly which systems were complaining about the stress. A group of Zephyrian soldiers approached their ship wearing armor that looked like it had been grown rather than manufactured, and carrying weapons that hummed with barely contained energy. Admiral Kethvar himself came to examine the primitive vessel that had somehow managed to enter their space without being detected by their sensor networks. He walked around the Lucky Strike with the careful attention of someone trying to understand a puzzle that made no logical sense. The hull was patched in dozens of places with materials that his scientists said should not be able to withstand the vacuum of space. The engine sections showed signs of modifications that violated fundamental principles of physics and engineering. The weapon systems appeared to be civilian mining equipment that had been converted for defensive purposes using methods that no rational being would attempt. Commander Zixtal pointed out that the aliens inside the ship seemed to be biological creatures, similar to many species they had encountered before, but their technology was unlike anything in the Imperial databases. The ship should not be able to fly, yet here it was after traveling through space for an unknown period of time. The power systems should have failed catastrophically, yet they were still functioning despite being connected in ways that made experienced engineers nervous just looking at them. Kethvar ordered his technical teams to begin a detailed analysis of the alien vessel, while he prepared to meet with its crew. Jake Morrison and his team were escorted through corridors that seemed to stretch for kilometers inside the Zephyrian ship. Everything around them was clean and perfect, and precisely designed for maximum efficiency. The walls were made from materials that felt warm to the touch, and seemed to respond to the presence of people walking near them. The lighting adjusted automatically to provide perfect illumination, without any visible source of the light itself. Kate found herself studying every detail of the alien technology with growing amazement and confusion. The Zephyrians had clearly mastered engineering principles that humanity was still trying to understand, yet their approach was completely different from human methods. Where humans built things to work despite problems and limitations, the Zephyrians seemed to build things that never had problems in the first place. They were brought to a meeting room where Admiral Kethvar waited with several of his officers and a collection of translation devices that would allow them to communicate despite speaking different languages. The Zephyrian leader was tall and graceful with features that reminded Dr. Cross of birds, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never encountered a problem he could not solve. Jake introduced himself and his crew, explaining that they were peaceful merchants who had become lost when their navigation systems failed. He apologized for entering Zephyrian space without permission and offered to leave immediately once their ship was repaired enough to travel safely. Admiral Kethvar listened to this explanation with growing confusion because nothing about their situation made sense according to his understanding of how space travel worked. Commander Zixtal presented the technical analysis of the Lucky Strike, reading from his datapad with the tone of someone reporting impossible things that nevertheless appeared to be true. The human vessel was powered by a fusion reactor that had been modified with spare parts from what appeared to be kitchen appliances. The navigation computer was connected to the life support system through a series of cables that included repurposed medical equipment. The artificial gravity was maintained by a device that seemed to be held together with adhesive substances and determination rather than proper engineering. The hull patches were made from materials that their best scientists could not identify, yet they were somehow providing structural integrity that should require much more sophisticated solutions. Kate Sullivan listened to the Zephyrian technical report with growing amusement, because they were describing her repair work as if it were some kind of mysterious alien technology. She had fixed the fusion reactor by replacing a burned-out regulator with the temperature sensor from the coffee maker, because both devices did essentially the same job of monitoring heat levels. The navigation computer was connected to life support, because she needed to borrow processing power from somewhere, and the environmental systems had plenty of spare capacity. The gravity generator was held together with structural adhesive, because the mounting brackets had broken, and the adhesive was stronger than the original brackets anyway. The hull patches were made from salvaged material she had collected over the years, because buying new hull plating was expensive and unnecessary when you could make your own repairs work just as well. Admiral Kethvar decided that the only way to understand these impossible humans was to see their abilities in action. So he brought Jake Morrison and his crew to the engineering section of the Eternal Dominion, where a critical environmental system had been malfunctioning for 3 days. The Zephyrian engineers had tried everything they knew to fix the problem, but the air recycling unit continued to operate at only 60% efficiency, despite being built with the finest technology in the galaxy. Kate Sullivan looked at the malfunctioning system for exactly 12 minutes before asking if she could borrow some basic tools and access to what the Zephyrians called their material reclamation facility. Commander Zixtal explained with obvious frustration that the air recycling system was a precision instrument that required specific replacement parts manufactured to exact specifications in authorized facilities using approved materials and procedures. Kate nodded politely and then asked where they kept their spare kitchen equipment and cleaning supplies, because she was pretty sure she could improve the efficiency by at least 200% using things they probably threw away every day. The Zephyrian engineers looked at each other with expressions that Dr. Nathan Cross recognized as the universal look of people who were convinced they were dealing with someone who had completely lost their mind. Jake Morrison tried to explain that Kate had a different approach to engineering that sometimes produced surprising results, but he could see that the Zephyrians were having trouble understanding how kitchen equipment could possibly help with a sophisticated life support system. Carlos Hernandez whispered to Amy Foster that this was going to be either really impressive or really embarrassing, and there was no way to tell which one until Kate either fixed the problem or made it much worse. Kate disappeared into the material reclamation facility and came back 20 minutes later carrying an armload of items that made the Zephyrian engineers even more nervous than they had been before. She had collected what appeared to be food preparation tools, cleaning chemicals, spare electronic components from broken entertainment devices, and several pieces of metal that had been destined for recycling into raw materials. Admiral Kethvar watched with fascination as Kate began taking apart the air recycling system with the confident movements of someone who had spent years making impossible repairs under difficult conditions. She removed panels and components with careful precision, studying each part before setting it aside in an organized arrangement that only she seemed to understand. The Zephyrian engineers stood nearby making worried sounds as she disconnected systems that were supposed to be permanently sealed and modified connections that were designed never to be altered. Commander Zix, Tal kept checking his datapad to monitor the environmental systems throughout the ship, because he was convinced that the human was about to cause a catastrophic failure that would endanger everyone aboard. Kate found the source of the efficiency problem in a filtration assembly that had been manufactured to specifications so precise that even tiny variations in atmospheric conditions caused it to work less effectively than it should. The Zephyrian approach to engineering meant that everything had to be perfect all the time, which worked well until conditions changed even slightly from what the designers had expected. She replaced 3 critical components with modified versions made from kitchen utensils that had the right size and shape to do the same job, but with enough flexibility to adapt to changing conditions. The cleaning chemicals she had collected were actually more effective at breaking down atmospheric contaminants than the expensive solutions the Zephyrians had been using, and they cost almost nothing to produce. The electronic components from the entertainment devices provided additional processing power that allowed the system to monitor and adjust itself automatically, instead of requiring constant manual calibration. When Kate finished her modifications and powered up the air recycling system, the efficiency readings immediately jumped to 320% of the original design specifications. The air in the engineering section became noticeably cleaner and fresher within minutes, and the system began operating with a smooth, quiet hum that replaced the labored sounds it had been making for days. The Zephyrian engineers stared at their instruments in complete silence, because the readings they were seeing should have been impossible according to everything they had learned about their own technology. Commander Zixtal ran diagnostic tests on the modified system 6 times because he could not believe that kitchen equipment and cleaning supplies had somehow made their advanced environmental controls work better than they ever had before. Admiral Kethover asked Kate to explain how she had known what modifications to make, and her answer made him feel more confused than he had ever felt in his entire career as a military commander. Kate explained that the problem with the Zephyrian system was that it was too perfect for real-world conditions, like trying to drive a race car on a bumpy road where you needed something that could handle unexpected situations, rather than something that only worked under ideal circumstances. She had simply replaced the rigid components with flexible alternatives that could adapt to changing conditions, while maintaining the same basic functions. The food preparation tools were made from materials that could handle temperature changes and chemical exposure better than the original parts, and they were designed to be cleaned and reused indefinitely, rather than replaced when they showed signs of wear. The cleaning chemicals worked better because they were formulated to handle a wide variety of contaminants, rather than being optimized for specific types of atmospheric pollution. The electronic components added adaptive capabilities that allowed the system to learn and improve its performance over time, instead of following fixed programming that could not respond to unexpected situations. Dr. Nathan Cross watched the Zephyrian engineers trying to understand Kate's explanations and realized that they were experiencing the same kind of culture shock that humans might feel when encountering technology that was far beyond their current understanding. The difference was that human technology was not more advanced than Zephyrian technology. It was just completely different in ways that challenged everything the Zephyrians believed about how engineering was supposed to work. Amy Foster noticed that some of the younger Zephyrian engineers were looking at Kate with expressions of fascination rather than confusion, and she wondered if they might be starting to understand that there could be more than one way to solve technical problems. Carlos Hernandez suggested that maybe they should show the Zephyrians some of the other modifications Kate had made to the Lucky Strike. But Jake Morrison quickly decided that might be more than their hosts were ready to handle in one day. Admiral Kethvar dismissed his engineering teams and asked to speak privately with the human crew because he was beginning to realize that these strange visitors represented either the greatest opportunity or the greatest threat that the Zephyrian Empire had ever encountered, and he needed to understand which one it was before he decided what to do with them. Admiral Kethovar stood alone in his private quarters staring out at the stars, while his mind struggled to process everything that had happened since the humans arrived on his ship. News of Kate Sullivan's impossible repair work had spread throughout the fleet faster than he could control, and now every Zephyrian engineer in the Armada was asking questions that challenged 3,000 years of Imperial engineering doctrine. Commander Zixtal had spent the entire night reviewing technical specifications and Imperial regulations, trying to find some explanation for how primitive aliens could improve Zephyrian technology using kitchen equipment and recycled materials. The reports coming in from other ships in the fleet were even more disturbing, because Zephyrian engineers were beginning to experiment with human techniques on their own systems, and the results were making traditional commanders very nervous about maintaining proper order and discipline. Captain Jake Morrison found himself in the unusual position of trying to explain human engineering philosophy to alien military officers who had never encountered the concept that something could work better than it was originally designed to work. Dr. Nathan Cross had been conducting medical examinations of volunteer Zephyrian crew members, and his findings were helping to explain why the two species approached problem-solving in such completely different ways. The Zephyrian brain was structured to think in highly organized patterns that made them excellent at creating complex systems that worked exactly as intended. But this same mental organization made it almost impossible for them to imagine alternative approaches when the original design encountered unexpected conditions. Kate Sullivan had been invited to give demonstrations to groups of Zephyrian engineers who wanted to understand how she had known which modifications to make to their environmental system. Her explanations were causing heated debates among the technical staff because she described engineering as an art that required creativity and intuition rather than a science that followed strict rules and procedures. Amy Foster watched these debates with growing concern because she could see that the Zephyrian military was splitting into two factions, with younger officers becoming excited about human adaptive techniques, while older commanders viewed any deviation from established procedures as dangerous chaos that threatened Imperial stability. Carlos Hernandez had been asked to demonstrate human piloting techniques, and his unconventional approach to spacecraft maneuvering was making Zephyrian flight instructors question everything they had taught about proper navigation and tactical movement. The human pilot could make their ships do things that should have been impossible, according to Zephyrian flight manuals, not because he had better technology, but because he was willing to push systems beyond their intended limits in ways that Zephyrian pilots had been trained never to attempt. Admiral Kethavar received reports from across the fleet that Zephyrian engineers were secretly modifying their own equipment using techniques they had learned from watching Kate work, and the improvements were so dramatic that it was becoming impossible to ignore the implications. Ships were reporting increased efficiency in everything from power generation to waste recycling, but they were also reporting that their systems were becoming unpredictable in ways that made traditional engineering officers uncomfortable. Commander Zixtal brought him intelligence reports suggesting that word of the humans had reached other sectors of the Empire, and some regional commanders were demanding that the aliens be eliminated before their dangerous ideas could spread further and undermine Imperial technological superiority. The debate was no longer just about whether humans were primitives or equals, but about whether the Zephyrian Empire could survive exposure to a completely different way of thinking about technology and problem-solving. Jake Morrison realized that his crew had accidentally started a revolution when Kate agreed to help with one simple repair, and now they were caught in the middle of a conflict that could determine the future of an entire galactic civilization. The younger Zephyrian officers who had been working with the humans were beginning to question not just their engineering procedures, but their entire military doctrine, wondering why they followed rigid protocols when creative solutions might be more effective. Dr. Cross warned that they needed to be very careful about how they proceeded because rapid cultural change could be traumatic for a species that had built their entire society around the principle that there was one correct way to do everything. Admiral Kethvar called a meeting with his senior staff to discuss what they should do with the humans, but the discussion quickly became an argument between officers who saw them as an opportunity to advance beyond their current limitations and officers who saw them as a contamination that threatened everything the Empire had built. Commander Zixtal argued that allowing human ideas to spread would lead to chaos and the eventual collapse of Imperial authority, while younger officers argued that refusing to adapt would lead to stagnation and eventual defeat by more flexible enemies. The reports from engineering teams throughout the fleet showed that human techniques could improve almost every system on their ships. But implementing those improvements would require abandoning the rigid quality control procedures that had been the foundation of Zephyrian technological superiority for millennia. Kate Sullivan found herself teaching informal classes to groups of Zephyrian engineers who were hungry to learn new approaches to solving technical problems. But she was also being watched by security officers who were concerned about the political implications of her lessons. Amy Foster noticed that some of the older Zephyrian commanders were beginning to look at the human crew with suspicion and hostility rather than curiosity, and she advised Jake that they might need to be prepared for trouble if the political situation continued to deteriorate. Carlos Hernandez had been invited to participate in flight training exercises, but he was also aware that some Zephyrian pilots viewed his unconventional techniques as violations of proper discipline that could lead to dangerous accidents. The tension throughout the fleet was becoming impossible to ignore as traditional officers struggled to maintain order while progressive officers pushed for reforms that would incorporate human adaptive techniques into standard Zephyrian procedures. Admiral Kethvar realized that he was facing the most important decision of his career, because choosing to embrace human ideas would fundamentally change the nature of the Zephyrian Empire, while choosing to reject them might mean missing the opportunity to evolve beyond their current limitations and face whatever challenges the galaxy might present in the future. Admiral Kethvar called an emergency session of the High Command and found himself standing before the most powerful military leaders in the Zephyrian Empire, knowing that his next words would determine the fate of both his civilization and the strange humans who had accidentally challenged everything they believed about technology and progress. Commander Zixtal presented his final report on the human threat, arguing with passionate conviction that allowing these chaotic aliens to continue spreading their dangerous ideas would lead to the complete breakdown of imperial order and the eventual destruction of everything. The Zephyrians had built over 3 millennia of careful expansion and technological refinement. The traditional commanders nodded in agreement as Zixtal described how human engineering techniques violated every principle of proper design and quality control, creating systems that worked through luck and improvisation rather than scientific precision and mathematical certainty.
Captain Jake Morrison
stood quietly beside his crew in the vast chamber where the fate of 2 species was being decided by aliens who still could not understand that different did not necessarily mean wrong or dangerous. Kate Sullivan watched the debate with the calm expression of someone who had spent her entire career proving that impossible. Things could work if you were willing to try approaches that other people said would never succeed. Dr. Nathan Cross studied the body language and facial expressions of the Zephyrian leaders, trying to understand the psychological pressures that were driving their decision-making process and the deep cultural fears that made change seem so threatening to a species that had achieved greatness through consistency and predictability. Amy Foster kept her hand ready near her weapon, not because she thought they could fight their way out of a situation like this, but because being prepared for trouble was what she did when everything was completely beyond her control. Carlos Hernandez looked around at the magnificent architecture of the Zephyrian Command Center and wondered if the beings who had built something so beautiful and complex would be wise enough to choose growth over stagnation when faced with the opportunity to become something even greater than they already were. Admiral Kethavar listened to the arguments from both sides and realized that the decision facing them was not really about the humans at all, but about what kind of civilization the Zephyrian Empire wanted to be in the centuries ahead. The younger officers spoke with excitement about the possibilities that human adaptive techniques could open up, describing improvements that could make their ships faster and more efficient, and more capable of handling unexpected challenges. They talked about exploration missions that could reach previously impossible destinations and defensive systems that could adapt to any threat without needing to be redesigned from scratch. Every time they encountered something new, the older commanders responded with warnings about the chaos that would result from abandoning the proven methods that had made the Zephyrian Empire the most powerful force in their sector of the galaxy. They argued that stability and predictability were more valuable than efficiency and adaptability because a civilization that changed too quickly would lose its identity and eventually collapse under the weight of its own confusion. Commander Zixtal made his final appeal to the High Command, asking them to consider whether they were willing to risk everything they had achieved for the sake of learning tricks from primitives who held their ships together with kitchen equipment and good intentions. Admiral Kethvar stood up to address the assembled leaders and felt the weight of history pressing down on him as he prepared to cast the deciding vote that would determine whether the Zephyrian Empire would choose evolution or preservation. He looked at Jake Morrison and his crew and saw not the dangerous primitives that Zixtal described, but representatives of a species that had learned to thrive by refusing to accept limitations and finding creative solutions to problems that seemed impossible to solve. He thought about the reports from across the fleet describing improvements that human techniques had brought to every system they touched, and he realized that the choice was not between safety and danger but between growth and stagnation. The Admiral cast his vote for partnership with the humans, explaining to the shocked High Command that the greatest threat to the Zephyrian Empire was not change, but the refusal to change when presented with opportunities to become stronger and more adaptable. The decision was not unanimous, but it was final, and within hours the news spread throughout the fleet that humans would be invited to share their knowledge with Zephyrian engineers in exchange for access to Zephyrian resources and manufacturing capabilities. Kate Sullivan found herself appointed as the chief advisor for a joint engineering project that would combine the best aspects of both species' approaches to technology, creating ships that could maintain Zephyrian precision and reliability, while gaining human adaptability and creative problem-solving abilities. Jake Morrison was offered command of the first vessel in a new joint exploration fleet designed to push the boundaries of known space, using principles that neither species could have developed alone. Dr. Cross began planning research programs that would help both species understand each other better and find ways to work together, despite their fundamental differences in thinking and culture. Amy Foster was asked to help develop new tactical doctrines that combined Zephyrian discipline with human improvisation, creating military strategies that could handle any situation regardless of how unexpected or unprecedented it might be. Carlos Hernandez became the lead instructor for a new piloting program that would teach both human and Zephyrian pilots to use techniques from both species to achieve capabilities that surpassed what either could accomplish independently. The Lucky Strike was transformed from a broken-down cargo hauler into the prototype for a new class of vessels that looked like traditional Zephyrian ships but incorporated human adaptive systems that could modify themselves to meet any challenge. Admiral Kethvar watched the launch of the first joint exploration mission and knew that the Zephyrian Empire had chosen the path that would lead them into a future full of possibilities they could never have imagined if they had remained isolated and unchanging. As the fleet disappeared into hyperspace to explore regions of the galaxy that had been considered too dangerous or too difficult to reach, he realized that the humans had given them something more valuable than improved technology. They had given them the courage to believe that impossible things were just problems that nobody had solved yet.